Gentlemen, brothers and sisters, welcome and thank you for coming along to support this morning's seminar on this beautiful sunny Canberra morning, coinciding with the opening of our 44th Parliament. So a very auspicious day. We have a very interesting seminar closing the GLAP Clearinghouse seminar, which, as you would be aware, is about exploring the evidence on engaging with Indigenous communities and improving community governance. My name's Russ Taylor. In my normal job, I'm Principal or CEO of AIHW, the Australian Institute of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Studies here in Canberra. But my specific role here this morning is to chair the seminar, and I'm very privileged and happy to do that. Without any further ado, of course, it's appropriate that we acknowledge and observe a very important cultural protocol. And in that context, I refer, of course, to acknowledging country, acknowledging traditional owners. And I have great pleasure in that context in introducing our next speaker, Aunty Agnes Shea, OAM, a very respected Ngunnawal elder, who is going to provide us with a welcome to country. Thank you very much, Aunty.
Thank you, Russell. Well, good morning, everyone. How are you on one of Canberra's lovely freezing mornings? But nevertheless, we must keep on keeping on. Like Russell said, I'm Aunty Agnes Shea and I'm one of the senior Ngunnawal elders, and I'm very proud and honoured to be invited here today to welcome you to the land of the Ngunnawal people. I'd like to start off by acknowledging our distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, and a very special welcome to all of our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Island friends and our non-Indigenous friends who've joined us here today. And anyone who may have joined us for the first time, a very special welcome to you. And those who've been here before, welcome back. And as an elder, I'd like to extend that welcome to all elders, regardless of your cultures. I'll quickly say a little bit about the Ngunnawal community, and then I'll explain why an elder is asked to come and do Welcome to Country and the meaning of it. And I'm sure most of the Canberras here are getting a bit tired of me doing this, but nevertheless, that's my job and I've got to do it. The Ngunnawal community are the traditional custodians of Canberra and the region. The audience may not be aware that the Ngunnawal nation is made up of several family groups and not just individuals who represent the interest of this country. Therefore, as a community, we have an elected body known as the United Ngunnawal Elders Council to represent us, along with the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Island elected body of the ACT. This is important for you to understand and acknowledge, for our identity is a collective identity. There are other Indigenous and non-Indigenous people from many nations around the country and the world who have come to live on Ngunnawal land, and I would like to acknowledge and pay my respects to them also, especially those who have joined us here this morning. And now I'll explain the meaning of a welcome. The tradition of welcoming people is a cultural practice, and that was handed down by our old people from the beginning of time. And what it means, before entering another person's country, you would always announce your arrival and not enter until a traditional owner of that country welcomed you. And the reason for this practice is to protect your spirit while you're in another person's country, but also show respect to the people of the country you're entering. And as one of the Ngunnawal elders, I'm always very proud to see when non-Indigenous organisations and government do ask an elder to come and do Welcome to Country. It shows that they are also respecting our traditional culture. And it helps to build the reconciliation and bring respect between many cultures of people who now live in the ACT and region, but also throughout Australia. And now I'd like to say a bit about this special event that's happening here today. We are here today for a seminar for the closing of the Gap Clearinghouse. The Clearinghouse organised this seminar to give Janet Hunt and Roxanne Bainbridge an opportunity to share with us what they have learned about engagement and governance for Indigenous people. And a very special welcome to you both. They have been some valuable information. They have some valuable information to share with us about the structures that organisations, including governments, need to set up so that Indigenous people can make decisions about their long-term goals and objectives for the communities. The papers also talk about how governments can better involve with Indigenous people in the decisions that affect their lives. The main message that I would like to give you today is that real consultation and engagement takes time, and that hurried one-off consultation that are organised without input from Indigenous people do not work. So thank you again for inviting me here. I'd love to stay and listen, but I have a very sick daughter at home. So please enjoy the morning. And when it's time for those who've travelled here today to join us, time for you to travel back home to your own countries, I wish you a very safe and enjoyable journey. And now I'll finish like I normally do in the language of the Ngunnawal people, Ngana Yarrabai Yangu, which means you're welcome to leave your footprints on our land now, or in other words, welcome to Ngunnawal country. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Auntie Agnes, for that, as usual, wonderful and very gracious welcome to country. Auntie Agnes has already given a very good overview of what this morning's about. As you would be aware, the Closing the Gap Clearinghouse is an online source of research and information on solutions and initiatives aimed at closing the gap on Indigenous disadvantage. And it seeks to focus on what works rather than on the nature or extent of our problems, which of course we know quite a bit about. Today's seminar is another valuable step towards linking research and policy by making the research available and accessible to all of us Australians who may have an interest in this information. What is of particular value to policymakers? And contains information that is of particular value to policymakers, program managers and service providers. Can I just say the approach today will be that we have two very interesting speakers. I'll introduce those in a moment. We'll have a break of morning tea between the two speakers, and then if my timing's right, we'll have plenty of time for questions at the end. So I would ask if you have a question as they arise, make a note of it, and hopefully we'll have an opportunity to explore that at the end of the two speakers. And as I say, we'll have morning tea in the meantime. I've also been asked to remind people that today's seminar will be webcast and recorded. So if you choose to identify yourself when asking a question, this will obviously be captured on the record. And my personal view is, as a courtesy, that I would ask that you do that. But it's not mandatory, just a courtesy issue. Okay, so I have much pleasure now in introducing our first speaker, and who is the author of 2 clearinghouse papers. And I refer, of course, to Dr. Janet Hunt. Janet is a Fellow of the Centre for Aboriginal Economic Policy Research, CAPER, at the Australian National University. And after a long career in international developments, followed by senior lecturing responsibilities in international development at both Deakin and RMIT universities, she moved into the field of Indigenous Australian development. Janet relocated to CAPER to manage what I know is quite a comprehensive and almost overwhelming project in terms of the community governance project that went from 2004 to 2008, which of course you would be aware is a major study of governance in Indigenous communities. Since then, Janet has continued her research interests in Indigenous governance and engagement, community development, while researching Indigenous engagement in natural resource management, particularly in New South Wales. She also teaches postgraduate courses in Australian Indigenous development. Would you welcome to the microphone Dr. Janet Hunt?
Well, thank you very much, Russell, and thanks very much to Auntie Agnes for her very lovely welcome to country. I'd like to pay my respects to her and the other elders of the Ngunnawal Elders Council, their ancestors and other Aboriginal people who are here today. I'd also like to thank the Closing the Gap Clearinghouse for the opportunity to undertake this piece of research and to present the findings here today. Thank you, Russell. So what I want to do is tell you about the literature review that I undertook, which was to explore what evidence there is about effective engagement with Indigenous communities. And it was a literature review task I undertook, not primary research. So what did I look for? Oh, wrong way. So what did I look for? I found the most research evidence around efforts at engagement at a regional level in Australia, as well as in 3 key sectors, which were health, natural resource management, and early childhood. I also looked for material about engagement with NGOs and companies, although most of the research is about engagement with government, state and federal. I looked specifically at other settler countries like Canada, US, New Zealand, as they're often seen as comparable with Australia, although I'd say the legal and policy frameworks are rather different. And I finally looked rather broadly for research about engagement with any marginalised communities and about place-based citizen engagement generally. Before I go on, I should just talk about the concept of engagement. In a major review of citizen engagement by Holmes, he defines it as a relatively sustained and systematic interaction, an ongoing process which at best results in joint determination of outcomes and confers legitimacy on them, which I've shortened to a sustained relationship towards shared goals. There's an idea of a spectrum of engagement, which you find in the literature. It's very common, with the level of participation of communities in policy or program development ranging from low to high. The spectrum ranges from informing or consulting at the low end, through advising and joint planning, to having control over some or most decisions. Governments tend towards the lower end, Aboriginal people seek engagement at the higher end. The research indicates that where problems are complex, or so-called wicked problems, such as in Indigenous affairs, then the level of engagement that works best is at the high end of the spectrum, so that people participate in defining the problem to be addressed as well as the solution. There is some evidence in Indigenous communities that supports this. For example, an evaluation of the communities in crisis policy in 4 remote Aboriginal communities in Western Australia illustrated the importance of involving people in a thorough diagnosis of the problem. However, it's also clear that engaging marginalised communities isn't easy. So what are some of the factors? I've called the first group History, Culture and Language. The history of engagements may affect current efforts. Indigenous people's experiences of engagement with settler society has been a harsh one, and Indigenous distrust of governments and others is entirely understandable. At the same time, Indigenous cultural practices and forms are very resilient and need to be understood and taken into account. People assert their cultural identities and may struggle to work cross-culturally with Western systems of governance, where responsibility for bridging the different usually falls heavily on them. Language is another important factor. That may be because people are being asked to operate in their second, third, or even fourth language, English. And even for fluent English speakers, government speak is another language as well. Effective communication is essential to successful engagement, and it requires well-prepared interpreters in more remote regions and care to make sure concepts are fully understood everywhere. Indigenous communities are very complex places with heterogeneous mixes of people with potentially different identities and interests, sometimes reflected in different organisations and with dispersed leadership. Knowledge of these complexities is important for successful engagement. Engaging only through representatives and public meetings can be fraught with challenges. Obviously, if you're seeking to engage, you have to think about the appropriate scale. And here we need to understand the concept of relational autonomy, whereby Indigenous people try to balance the autonomy of a small group with a desire to maintain connections with a wider network of relationships. Judgments need to be made about the level of engagement needed for different purposes within that framework. There may be a need for multi-layered engagement. Now, if engagement is a sustained relationship, then Indigenous people need to have governance arrangements in place that enable them to collectively engage with governments. And this will often require governments to invest in Indigenous governance and management capacities to support the ongoing processes of engagement. Indigenous organisations are the most visible expressions of this governance and can assist people to engage with outsiders, but we need to be sensitive to the challenges and constraints that they face as the intermediaries, balancing different worldviews, aspirations and expectations. The purpose of engagement also needs to be clear, but a most important finding is that the purpose of engagement must be related to Indigenous aspirations if it's to be successful and sustained. And finally, timeframes have to be adequate and responsive, and there need to be creative ways for people to have input. It could be oral, it could be by video, and this applies particularly to policy and funding issues, not just in written form. I had a look at the policy context and recent approaches to engagement, which I don't have time to go into today. At the national level, we now have an engagement framework and an MOU with the National Congress of Australia's First Peoples. There have been a multitude of guidelines, largely about how to do a consultation. And since 2000, year 2000, we've had a host of different approaches to engagement, by the Commonwealth and by other jurisdictions. Some of these most recent innovations at the state and territory level don't have publicly available evaluations, which is a pity, as I'm sure there's plenty to learn from them. The Remote Focus organisation has conducted a great deal of research about engagement in decision-making in remote Australia, arguing that the current complex governance arrangements in remote regions are not fit for purpose. Finally, it's important to mention that some sorts of engagements, particularly relating to land and cultural heritage, need to take account of legislative frameworks on native title and or the land rights regimes in different jurisdictions. Since Australia has indicated support for the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, we should also look at the relevant clauses in that declaration about engagement, and here they are. Indigenous peoples have a right to participate in decision-making through their own representatives and institutions that they determine, and the concept of free, prior and informed consent is at the heart of this. There is no research in Australia on how this is being implemented, at least not that I could find, so I can't say how much it's being used, except to note that the Murray-Darling Basin Authority has written this into its own Aboriginal engagement principles, so perhaps in the future we can assess this. I also don't have time today to go into the detail of the international evidence, but overall it reflects engagement on the basis of self-government, treaty or agreement-like relationships, and it emphasises the importance of investing in Indigenous capacity and resources, noting the important role played by First Nations organisations. It also emphasises respect for First Nation values and difference from settler society, and very early engagement with Aboriginal people, particularly where resource projects are concerned. As I mentioned, the literature on engagement is quite strong in Australia in relation to various efforts to engage at a regional level as well as in those sectoral areas. There are some very, very consistent findings across this quite diverse array of studies. I'm going to focus on the regional ones first. So this is drawing on 16 reports or studies, which between them cover 12 regions, including each jurisdiction, as you'll see. And they're covered from a period of mid-2000s to last year. So there were evaluations of all 7 COAG trials, 5 different studies of the Murdi-Paki Regional Assembly, including Aboriginal and bureaucratic perspectives on that, 3 other Western Australian studies, 1 from Queensland and another from the Northern Territory. The latter I only received as the paper was being finalised, but interestingly, it confirmed many of the success factors I'd drawn out of the other studies, and I'll talk in more detail about it shortly. So what worked? Well, it boils down to leadership, resources, participatory processes, and governance and capacity building. So let's unpack those. Looking at leadership first. It's really important, and where things worked, there was high-level government engagement within a clear policy framework which was adaptable for local conditions, enabling a whole-of-government agenda and a holistic place-based approach. Where there were regionally based senior people who had some decision-making authority, high-level negotiation skills, and an ability to listen carefully to what's being expressed. And they, in turn, had skilled, culturally competent staff capable of building trust and respectful relationships between governments and community representatives. Where there was leadership across all levels, governments and communities, and those people on the ground were willing to try new approaches and to make things work. And that old adage, one size doesn't fit all communities, is borne out. In terms of resources, things worked better where the partnership processes themselves were resourced, with staff to manage the engagement and follow up on decisions made, where there were resources available to build partner capacities and undertake the programs that were jointly agreed, and where there were flexible funds available for all these purposes. There was also greater success where communities were setting the agenda, initiating actions and determining priorities. Local solutions were planned collaboratively so that strategies empowered people. Planning started from community level upwards to the regions. And there was a level of autonomy for local groups to decide their own priorities and activities and have a voice in their own development. Where there was identification of Aboriginal strengths, assets and positives, leadership capabilities and potentials were developed, and government staff were avoiding negative judgments. As Denise Hagen said, less monitoring, more mentoring. There was clarity about processes and effective communication between partners and within agencies. Information sharing was key. Where there was clarity and agreement about desired outcomes and indicators, and well-developed plans to achieve them, again with clarity in relation to decision-making, actions and responsibilities, where there were achievable, realistic goals, and no promising what couldn't be delivered. And finally, where there were long time frames, so that people, as Denise Hagen put it, work at their pace and in their spaces, realising that change is chaotic and emergent. It is not a linear process. In relation to governance and capacity building, success was greater where people built on existing Indigenous governance structures, mechanisms and processes wherever possible. Often Indigenous bodies had developed or evolved over many years. Where there was support and capacity building for communities and community representatives for engagement with governments, with ongoing governance development, with processes and structures designed by Aboriginal people and hence viewed by them as legitimate. Where there was cultural legitimacy, in that sense, and government funding, both of which are essential requirements for developing a regional Aboriginal governance body with which governance can engage. Now let me turn to the example of regional engagement which showed signs of success. And as I say, I could hardly believe how consistent this was with the things I had drawn out already from the other regional studies. This is the Groote Island and Bickerton Island Regional Partnership Agreement. This RPA involves three partners: the Anandillyaaqua Land Council, which is a traditional owner body under the Northern Territory Aboriginal Land Rights Act, the Northern Territory Government, and what was then FACSIA, and involved the communities of both the islands. The RPA was broad. It covered 10 areas of activity, from township leases, planning and infrastructure, housing, health, education, youth, sport and rec, and community safety. The 10 areas also included, importantly, leadership and governance and support for the partnership. And the evaluation report of the second stage of this program was very positive. So what does this report suggest as the factors in its positive findings? Well, it stresses that this success can't be attributed to one factor, or indeed several factors, in isolation. It's the combination of a number of key inputs and processes that's determined its overall success, it says. And these included ministerial support from both governments, a community-driven partnership work, that the Land Council took a strategic approach, so strong governance there. Interestingly, a community contribution, financial contribution, which gave them considerable leverage in negotiations, so it evened up the power. Funding arrangements and allocation of funds on top of that. Positive working relationships where respect and trust were built, and some agreed principles had underpinned the partnership. Where there was vision and strong high-level leadership, and the region that was selected reflected a sense of place by that community. There was attention to effective implementation. It was well supported administratively, and there was attention to evidence of good practice and what works. However, nothing's perfect. The evaluation said that there still needed improvement in relation to more integrated plans and pooled funding, better alignment across the governments, and more streamlined and collaborative processes at the local level. The evaluation team mentioned these some unique factors, such as the fact that this was one language and cultural group, and that the community did have some of its own resources to commit. But they concluded that a number of other factors were very replicable elsewhere. And here's the things they thought were replicable. The equality between the partners and the authority each had given to proceed, the community needs and aspirations driving the agenda, the objectives and priorities that were shared by all the parties, the detailed planning and negotiation from the outset, those underlying principles of operation as a touchstone for the partnership, adequate resourcing and a long time frame, and the responsive and efficient management. All right. So going back to the broader literature, regional literature, what didn't work? I've grouped these under three headings: government arrangements, community capacities, and relationships. So engagement didn't work so well where government's own arrangements didn't support it. And this may have been because different jurisdictions and departments had different priorities, expectations, levels of commitment, or policy and implementation frameworks that were never resolved to enable effective whole-of-government working with Indigenous partners. Where high-level government goals weren't adequately translated into specific plans and actions with clear responsibilities, or where solutions were designed outside the community and were implemented, or where there were fragmented short-term projects. Didn't work so well either where organisational cultures discouraged flexibility and risk-taking, and more junior staff couldn't make government aspirations happen. Where there was insufficient focus on relationship building, too much turnover of key personnel in governments and sometimes in communities as well, or where there were fly-in, fly-out services that simply didn't have time to build relationships, or where there was an absence of streamlined and flexible funding. It also didn't work so well where communities had a weaker capacity to engage with government, or where they were cynical about the ability of governments to change, and where there was little government support for the necessary community learning and capacity building, or where communities had problems in their own community-level governance which impeded their leaders' ability to engage effectively with governments. In terms of relationships, engagement wasn't so successful where there was insufficient participation and sense of shared ownership by Indigenous people in decision-making, governance and accountability, where there weren't genuinely shared objectives, performance indicators or benchmarks, and where there wasn't shared access to local level data for monitoring and evaluation. It's quite important. Or where government agencies weren't clear about roles and responsibilities in partnership arrangements, or didn't follow agreed processes, or where government limitations were not made clear to Indigenous partners from the outset. Moving on then to the sectoral findings, there were many similarities across the different sectors, but just to summarise down, 12 health, 9 early childhood case studies, 14 natural resource management studies, and 3 studies of engagement with non-government organisations. Here's the key success factors that emerged. So long-term relationships based on trust, working within a framework of Aboriginal-driven decision-making, where power inequalities are addressed through strong mutual accountabilities, where there were culturally competent staff, and where there was shared responsibility and accountability for shared objectives. So it starts to get a bit repetitive. But let me give you an example of challenges in engagement in the NRM sector, some of the things that haven't worked. And this is a study of engagement in coastal zone planning in central Queensland. And it identified a number of barriers to Indigenous engagement. So the first was Aboriginal people's lack of financial and technical resources, but there was a lot more. Inequity, Indigenous people being expected to participate voluntarily in meetings where everyone else is paid, where Aboriginal people are expected to attend bureaucratic meetings with set agendas and discuss issues through what they see as a Western lens, where Aboriginal people had low levels of confidence that they'd be listened to and their knowledge respected, and where government agencies and others failed to acknowledge the considerable diversity among Aboriginal people. In this case, there were 3 distinct cultural groups with their own languages, customs, aspirations, and so on. So the result of this combination is what they perceive as tokenistic consultation and resource disparity, and this weakens Aboriginal people's commitment to participation. So they suggested some strategies for overcoming this sort of disempowering environment for Aboriginal people. So the solutions they suggested were Aboriginal people agenda setting, ensuring the full range of Indigenous interests are represented, capacity building, support, both financial and other, for Aboriginal involvement, and modification of processes and structures, whilst also considering, this is an environmental context, the social justice agenda for Aboriginal people, cultural awareness training for government about Aboriginal ways of doing business, and in particular how those particular groups view the coastal environment holistically, which helps build non-Indigenous capacity to engage with Aboriginal people. Ensuring Aboriginal specific views are respected, recorded, and investing in relationships and communication based on equality, openness, and respect for each other's values. And supporting the development of Aboriginal governance structures. In this case, an Elders Committee emerged that facilitated Aboriginal people's involvement. And this starts to challenge the power inequalities. So, to summarise, all the studies about Aboriginal and more broadly marginalised people's engagement, I think it comes down to 3 key things: relationships, participatory processes, and governance and leadership. So I'll very quickly finish by running through those. So relationships, obviously responding to Indigenous history, cultures, and social dynamics, contemporary, valuing skills and knowledge of community organisations and Indigenous people themselves, clarity about the purpose and the relevant scale for engagement, and relating engagement to Indigenous concepts of well-being, not just COAG targets, important though they are. In terms of relationships, we need long-term relationships of trust, respect, and honesty, accessible ongoing communication and information in all directions, effective governance and capacity, both in the Indigenous communities and among governments, and appropriate timeframes. In terms of participatory processes, we need Indigenous agency and decision-making from the outset. So we have an Indigenous-driven process with government in the role of facilitator, enabler. Building on Indigenous community governance structures and Indigenous strengths and assets. So it's an empowering process with small achievements towards mutually agreed longer-term goals and targets. Recognition of power inequalities, I've mentioned that before, and sincere attempts to share power through agreements. Transparency of decision-making processes and agreed conflict resolution mechanisms. Really strong mutual accountability relationships embedded in agreements, and a high degree of clarity about desired outcomes and indicators. And clearly defined roles and responsibilities in agreements and partnerships, and some continuity of personnel. And parties engaging in joint planning of monitoring and evaluation, it's not a lot of that happens, to meet the rights and needs of each. And finally, governance and leadership. Well, we need effective and legitimate Indigenous governance arrangements, strong and strategic Indigenous leadership, which is resourced and supported for the engagement, very high-level leadership flexibility and secure and adequate resources within governments, but also honesty about resource or other limitations or parameters so that achievable goals are set, and culturally competent staff able to build trusting relationships. We need investment in strengthening the governance of both Indigenous and government partners for effective partnership working, building on existing community organisations and governance structures, and probably most important, governments with the capacity to respond to Indigenous priorities with pooled and flexible funding arrangements. All right, so that's my brief summary of a vast quantity of research studies that I looked at. Thank you for listening, and I hope we can have a discussion about how you can put that all into practice.
Thank you, Janet, for an extremely clear presentation, and also thank you for finishing right on time. We shall adjourn now for morning tea. Could I ask that we be back in the room at 10:25 sharp? Hold your questions, I'm sure you've got some, and we'll certainly allow plenty of time for questions at the end of the next speaker's session, and I'll be pleased to introduce her at 10:25. Thanks very much.
happen.
Did you participate in the West Australian? Oh, good.
And I didn't have a problem that day. It's just one of
Yeah,
those
it is.
days when you can't keep anything.
Well, we might get Janet to join us up here, eh?
Oh, I think she doesn't. Oh, okay.
No questions.
Yeah, yeah, okay. You don't want to sit up. Don't want to be up here with me, is that right?
Well, let me introduce you. We've got, unfortunately, writing instructions to get out of the place,
Yeah.
which is a shame, you know.
That's why there's
Yeah, no, it is.
morning tea in the middle. We didn't have that last time. So I think
Yeah.
that's why. So people kind of don't dwell.
Gary?
Gungri.
Hungry. Good. Please, I asked you.
Doesn't matter. I don't know what else.
Oh no, gotta get it right, gotta get it right. Okay. Okay. Welcome back. I'm now about to introduce our next speaker. Thank you for being so prompt. Unfortunately, we are under a time restraint. I'm told that we've got to vacate the premises by 11:25, I think it is, this morning. There's an apprentice politician about to make a speech. So I do apologise for that, but we do have to have an eye to the clock. So without any further ado, I have great pleasure in introducing our next speaker and presenter, Dr. Roxanne Bainbridge. Roxanne's the co-author of a clearinghouse paper with Komla Say, Jay, Yunya McCalman and Kath Brown. Roxanne Bainbridge is a Gungri woman from southwestern Queensland. She's part of a growing body of Indigenous scholars, collectively known as the National Indigenous Research and Knowledges Network, led by Professor Aileen Morton-Robertson, and I'm pleased to say that my own organisation, AATSIS, is part of that alliance. And this initiative is endeavouring to significantly increase the quality of research involving Indigenous Australians. Roxanne is currently employed as a Senior Research Fellow in the Cairns Institute at James Cook University. Her work is embedded in Indigenous empowerment and social inclusion research and has a particular focus on the social determinants of Indigenous health and wellbeing. Mentored herself by Professor Komla Say, Roxanne's foremost research activity at the moment is a project funded by the Australian Research Council that's investigating mentoring into education and employment and Indigenous students, for Indigenous students. Would you welcome to the microphone Dr. Roxanne Bainbridge. Thank you, Roxanne.
Okay, thanks, Russell. And I'd just firstly like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands upon which we're meeting today, and also pay my respects to their elders, my elders, and any elders in the room, and also to our children who are the future generations for us. I'd like to start, I guess, with positioning myself so that you understand where I come from, and I'd like to start first by saying, as Russell introduced me, that I'm a Gungri woman from southwestern Queensland, and that has a great bearing on how I view and see things in the world. I'm also a researcher at James Cook University, and that also has an impact on how I see things, and potentially is, in conflict with policymakers, I guess, and other government departments at times. But the two are more and more coming together, and we're doing our best to meet levels of government and how they want to work and try to fit into their agendas, and we're hoping that that can be done the same. And things are changing around Australia, with NIRICN, the National Indigenous Knowledges Network. There's soon to be some 300 Indigenous researchers with PhDs working out across Australia. So things are changing a lot in that regard, and ways of working with people, and so therefore, you know, bringing new perspectives. Things change on how we work and how we do business. But at the end of the day, as a researcher, I really think about what Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people are trying to do to improve their own circumstances, and how our work can actually add value to that situation rather than imposing. My research work is embedded with the Empowerment Research Program. I work in a small team of Indigenous and non-Indigenous researchers. My colleague Janya McCullum, I'd like to acknowledge her, she's in the front row there. And it's led by Professor Komla Che. We've been working a lot around empowerment. We aim to look at acknowledge what contributions notions of empowerment make to the social determinants of health and wellbeing for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. We define empowerment more broadly, I guess, than sometimes, you know, people use that term as, it's just a term really, it's just one of those buzzwords that's sort of bandied around without really a whole lot of thought to what it means. So we follow Minkler and Wallerstein's definition, who define empowerment as a social action process by which individuals, communities and organisations gain mastery over their lives in the context of changing social and political environments to improve equity and their own quality of life. We've worked with partner organisations across a range of areas in health, education, palliative care, chronic disease, health promotion, so we're quite a multidisciplinary team. And of course, empowerment cuts across that, and all of these research areas are some way related to concepts of governance. Now, when I was thinking about presenting today, I thought about representing the paper. We actually had a little bit of a brainstorm, and we decided that we'd take a few points from the paper and elaborate those in a more sort of practical way, and what this can look like in practice. So the 4 items on the agenda are the importance of evaluation research. These all came from the governance paper. Capacity strengthening 2 ways, that is strengthening the capacity of both Indigenous organisations and governments, so really exploring ways of working together in relationships and partnerships. The fact that governance operates at multiple levels and they are interrelated. And all of this work also relates to what Janet's just presented, so quite complementary really. And the importance of strengthening soft capacities alongside hard capacities is something that's not often thought about. Okay, getting back to the first point, importance of evaluation research. When we conducted the review for the paper, the resource sheet, of the 127 references that focused on Indigenous Australian governance, only 12 or 9% provided accounts of programs designed to improve governance through strengthening organisational capacity. Of these, 3 focused on strengthening the capacity of leaders, 3 involved informal governance through groups, 4 accounted for Indigenous organisations, and 2 related to COAG initiatives. Accounts were predominantly descriptive, and so what that means is that we have a relatively poor evidence base from which to draw to understand what we need to do better and how to do it. So building on that notion, I think if we really think about the closing the gap work that's been very quite industriously working together, and I certainly hope that it gets funded next year. Again, I think, you know, across a vast range of issues, there's sort of themes that come up, and really we don't know a whole lot about what works. It comes up time and time again, and I think this is demonstrated in other areas. Sanson Fisher's work, 2006, reviewed Indigenous health, and that revealed also a strong focus on descriptive research. with very little measurement research and intervention research. Paul et al.'s review of the sorry state of the evidence base for improving the health of Indigenous populations in Canada, the United States, New Zealand and Australia found only 19 of the 665 intervention studies that met rigorous quality criteria methodologically, and really they were not sufficient to confidently establish the effectiveness of strategies to improve health outcomes. So really, if you think about that, you think, well, Aboriginal people have been researched to death, yet researchers really haven't stepped up and governments haven't done their bit as well on the other side to bring the evidence that's really needed to make things happen and change. Our own systematic review findings, we've done quite a vast range of systematic reviews in mentoring, sexual assault, cultural competency, child and maternal health. They all indicate the same things. So there's a real issue of just an overwhelming descriptive research out there and not much evaluation or intervention research. I guess what's pointing to there is that there really needs to be a balance of those three types of research. We're still only in the very early stages of development in most Indigenous research, and that to make things happen, we need to change that. So one of the ways of doing that is we need to account for rigorous evaluations in the implementation of programs, but also people need to have the think about, I guess, accounting for that very early at the application stage, so that they are encouraged to include evaluations and the costs to do that in their funding applications. So I guess coming back to the issue of strengthening capacity for improving Indigenous governance, I thought just, let's consider a little bit of the history just briefly. In the 1970s, national policies encouraged Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander efforts towards autonomy through the empowerment of community-level organisations. Indigenous communities played leading roles in building community-controlled local government, health, housing, alcohol rehabilitation and welfare services. I guess in the 1990s, the term community capacity building, rather than strengthening, emerged, but there was little evidence about how that actually worked as well, or whether it worked at all. It entered the Australian policy arena in 1996 within the context of concern for reducing welfare dependency, fostering local participation and decision-making, and trialling new approaches to partnerships and coordination across governments. As such, capacity strengthening became an intercultural phenomenon, whereby organisational capacity strengthening for Indigenous community governance needed to involve intercultural engagement between Indigenous people, their organisations and governments. Getting confused, governments. Getting the balance right here has been incredibly difficult, particularly between operational autonomy, political support, performance and accountability. So Janet's more than adequately explored governance in this area and refers to it as the evolving processes, relationships, institutions and structures by which a group of people, community or society organise themselves collectively to achieve the things that matter to them. I think for Indigenous people, what does this mean? It means actively strengthening decision-making and control over their organisations and building on people's personal and collective contributions and shared commitment to their organisations' chosen governance processes, goals and identity. But one of the fundamental challenges to achieving Indigenous community governance is a lack of agreed understanding. So each community is different and local decisions need to be made about group membership and identity, who has authority in the group and over what, agreed rules to ensure authority is exercised properly and decision makers are held accountable, how decisions are enforced, how rights and interests with others are negotiated, and what arrangements will best enable the achievement of goals. And that comes also from Janet's work. I'd like to acknowledge her again. To reach these decisions, there needs to be workable partnerships in place, and in this context, the second point to be made is that we reconsider one-sided approaches previously undertaken by governments and others. So really thinking about how researchers, governments and other people can work with Indigenous communities in enabling governance processes, but also thinking about two-way capacity enhancement. So for government to work through partnerships and for communities to be better supported to improve their own situations. So really the question to ask is what enabling approaches are available for Indigenous organisations to make these decisions, and more, what approaches can these processes, how can we facilitate these in processes of partnerships? So I'd just like to talk about here on our own research. One strategy that our team has effectively used is participatory action research. It's sometimes standalone, sometimes it's combined with an Aboriginal developed program. It's an empowerment and social and emotional wellbeing education program. We've used PAR as a way of working to make things better in schools, in men and women's groups, health services, community-controlled organisations. So, and it seems to be quite feasible and acceptable to Aboriginal partners. So it's a cyclic process, and I don't know, it's pretty straightforward. It's a cyclic process where you diagnose the situation, you reflect on what's on the actual situation as it stands, so looking at what's working, what's not working, and then you act on it to improve it. You come back, you measure, evaluate the effectiveness of the action, and reflect on learnings from those actions and plan next steps. So it just becomes a cycle of ongoing continuous quality improvement, really. So we use established questions to facilitate this process, and really very simple: how are we going, what's happening, what is working, what is not working, are we getting our fair share of resources relative to needs, who is benefiting and who is missing out, and how can we reach those people who are missing out, and how can we improve our own situation. So it's really closely akin to continuous quality improvement that people might be more familiar with, but it's been used in both Aboriginal organisations and government's departments, and although it's a new way of doing business, it can be a little bit challenging for some people, and it's really interesting, but it seems to be more challenging for governments than it is for communities. So it's quite amenable to the ways Aboriginal people work. But having said that, the process isn't always perfect, and we have had incidents where it hasn't been, not that it hasn't been facilitated well or anything like that. It's just the nature of the group that's and the dynamics of that group. We had a situation where we had two concurrent projects happening around CDEP. One was facilitated by a local Aboriginal man in Yarrabah, and the other one was facilitated by government. The local situation worked extremely well, while the government project actually disbanded and didn't actually go anywhere. And reflecting on that, I think I'd have to say that it didn't have the local input, even though we had asked. We tried to facilitate more communication strategies. They didn't occur either. It just didn't seem to matter what we did. It just didn't meet. When they had to reflect on what they were doing, they were so far removed from the on-the-ground reality that that couldn't occur either. So, so just the nature of the group and their roles in the group is very important, and something that Janet raised as well. Just on another piece of work that we did through our team, this particular approach was used in our health initiatives where nurses and health workers were required to work together in a team approach. The effective elements are framed down there as empowerment attributes of a transdisciplinary and a transcultural teamwork model. But I think what the most important thing here, well, it's not most important because they have to go hand in hand, but the empowerment attributes, they need to happen at multiple levels. If you don't start from the top, if you don't have the bottom and you don't have those in between, it just doesn't function. So, yeah, you're looking at holistic approaches to achieving partnership models. Okay, so, and this is one that I guess a lot of our work focuses on, and that's the importance of strengthening soft capacities alongside hard capacities. I think first we need to consider the nature of capacity strengthening. So strengthening capacity is about accessing opportunities and processes to enhance an organisation's abilities to perform specific actions, solve problems and set and achieve goals, and as Janet says, to get things done. But it needs development from both sides. So when you think about the hard capacities like resources, technical skills, functions, structures, equipment, that sort of thing, we often find that yes, there's lots of training, there's lots of this, there's lots of that, but people can't use them because there's a gap. The other side has to be development of soft capacities. When we're talking about soft capacities, we're talking about morale, engagement, motivation, values, incentives and staff wellbeing. In cross-cultural partnership contexts, there also needs to be a focus on the cultural and cross-cultural elements, and to work not from the assumption of Western approaches, but Janet again talked about this, but to work from an Indigenous perspective and be guided by that and be open to different ways of working. So how can this be done? So as reported in the resource sheet, we know three things. We know that strengthening organisational capacity of both Indigenous and government organisations is critical to raising the health, wellbeing and prosperity of Indigenous Australian communities. Improving the governance processes of Indigenous organisations is also likely to require strengthening of Indigenous and government organisational values, goals, structures, arrangements that influence employees' behaviour and wellbeing. And we also know that the involvement of Indigenous people in decision-making about their own development is critical. So highlighted here is the need to support empowerment and wellbeing and of Indigenous people or others working with them as well, because it goes hand in hand. And whether that's at a personal level or at a community level or organisational level, that doesn't matter. But it's a key gap that's often arising, and I see it often in the Closing the Gap resource sheets, and it's something that Professor Pat Dudgeon raised a few weekends ago in the Australian, along with Tom Calmer. They raised concerns of developing social and emotional wellbeing of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. And it's a clear gap, and it stops the uptake. It's all about developing those soft capacities and stops the uptake of participating in training, employment and that sort of thing. So for capacity enhancement to thrive, for Indigenous governance to thrive, a key priority is around the development of social and emotional empowerment as the precursor to development. So here I also bring in some of our own work. So we work often in family wellbeing program. It's a social and emotional wellbeing program, and we use it to enable, as a tool of engagement, to enable processes of governance. And so for over the past decade, or even much longer right now. We've used family wellbeing to enhance the capacity of Aboriginal Australians. It's developed in Adelaide, 1993. It provides a safe environment in which people can have different conversations to those they might have experienced in the past. So it's about acknowledging past historical injustices, but not dwelling on that, but focusing on how can we move forward. Its usefulness and as an empowerment tool can be demonstrated by its transfer, and it's been transferred across Australia in 56 geographical sites and also internationally to Ghana, Canada and Papua New Guinea. Okay, so I guess the take-home messages, just to summarise, is around the importance of evidence, because we're very good at describing the extent of the problem and what needs to happen, but there are so few evaluations of actually what works. Second, the need for two-way capacity enhancement, for a government to work through partnership and for communities to be better supported to improve their own social and emotional well-being because of the wider benefits towards employment, training, child safety, all the COAG targets. Acknowledge that governance works at different levels and they are interrelated. And also Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander empowerment and social and emotional well-being are critically important to capacity strengthening, but they have not been well supported. And I'd just like to thank the Clearinghouse for inviting us to and have the opportunity to talk about our work, and also to my colleagues who worked on the paper, and Dr. Janya McCalman, Professor Comla Che and Kath Brown. And that's all. Thank you.
I won't come to the mic, I'm sure you can hear me. I'll ask Janet to come up and join us. We're going to have some questions. Please, if you could indicate, I'll try and do my best to identify everybody that wants to ask a question. I think we've got a roving mic available. We have. So, first question. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Kathleen O'Ryan. I'm in Indigenous Affairs in Prime Minister and Cabinet, working on Stronger Futures. I just had a question in relation to governance engagement structures. The Northern Territory Government is currently revising or reviewing and changing its shire structures to introduce local authorities, and I just wondered what your view would be about how that might impact on engagement.
I don't know if that microphone's on, is it? Yeah? Okay. I haven't looked closely at the reorganisation of the shires, although I know that there were significant problems with the earlier iteration of the shires, and those very much related to the loss of control that Aboriginal people had at the local level. So it relates to that point I was making about the scale, the level of engagement, and I think there was a lot of disaffection because people were losing decision-making authority so that they only had advisory boards at the local level. And I think the new arrangements, which I say I haven't looked at in great detail, but they're aiming to bring some of that control back to the local level, as far as I understand it, so that's good. I think when I was working on the governance project, there was a much slower process underway of regional authorities that were developing, and we studied one of those, the West Arnhem. And I kind of look back now, and that got superseded by the first Shires model. And that was a negotiated process that was going on among Aboriginal people and with the two levels of government. And there was a great deal of Aboriginal ownership of what might have emerged as the West Arnhem Regional Authority. But governments got frustrated that this was a bit slow, and in came the first Shires model. And I look back and I think, well, now they're going back because that Shires model wasn't very successful, so now they're having to redo the Shires model. Had they been patient and let some of those regional authorities emerge, they'd have been up and running and functioning quite well by now, because we've had another few years go by. So I think sometimes the lesson out of the Shires thing, and this isn't exactly answering your question, but there's an important lesson out of the Shires thing, that, which is to do with levels of control and is to do with timeframes and cultural geographies. I didn't talk about that. That sort of comes out of the governance report. But basically, things work better. And actually, the Groote Eylandt study kind of makes a sideways reference to it, that it was one cultural group. But things do work better where you have got a boundary around what you're doing, which makes sense culturally. It could well be a contributing factor to why Fitzroy Futures works. That seems to be working really well, Fitzroy Futures, from what I'm hearing. Yeah.
Thank you for the question. Next question. Right up the back, thank you.
Working? Yes. Jennifer Pitcher, Prime Minister and Cabinet. If the government was to develop a whole-of-government capacity building strategy for Indigenous organisations, what would you recommend should be the key elements of such a strategy?
So what you're after, what would be the key elements of a capacity building strategy for Indigenous organisations? Yeah, indeed it would. Okay, well, I would say I think the first thing is to look at what capacities exist, where there is already capacity, and to explore what are the conditions that enable that capacity to have developed and to continue to maintain itself. And I think one of the areas that seems to me to have some good capacity is in the community-controlled health sector, for example. Seems to be one of the stronger sectors. And so then you'd need to look at, well, why? What are the conditions that enabled that sector to develop as strongly as it has? It may need more capacity building, I don't know, I'm sure it does, but it's a much stronger sector than many others. And it seems to me that there's a number of things, and I haven't done research in this area, but I've observed it and I've kind of reflected on why this might be. So obviously it's had strong support from a mainstream department, but with its own office within that department. So it's had what would appear to be good, strong policy frameworks, but specific for that sector. It's had, in a number of states, well, it's had a national organisation with a role of capacity building. It's also got a number of state and territory associations, AMSANT in the territory, for example, Quake in Queensland, and others, which play a role of networking, peer learning, capacity building, and so on. Obviously, there's been a strong effort to build the capacity of staff in that sector, both medical staff, nursing staff, and other staff associated in that sector. So it's got a strong Aboriginal staffing component. I'm sure there's many other things, but to me it seems to, it's also, because it's health, and there are certain requirements in terms of standards and protocols, it's risen to the challenge. You know, people have been supported to reach those standards and they've met them. which demonstrates that it's perfectly possible. So I think I'd look at some of those things as a starter and then say, all right, where do we go then to build our strategy based on what we know from that piece of evidence? And obviously, it would need to be done in partnership with Indigenous leaders. So I'd get a group together that knows something about this, leaders of Indigenous organisations, and sit down with them and work that strategy out with them. So I don't want to say to you what the strategy must be. I will talk to you about the process I would go through. So you've got, you know, the Congress of First Peoples. They could probably identify for you a range of people who you could sit down with and really work through a strategy. They would undoubtedly help you in doing that. And obviously you would need to get out on the ground and talk to the organisations whose capacity you're trying to strengthen as to what is it they need. Now often what they'll tell you is they need longer term, more flexible funding so that the people in the senior levels of those organisations who have a great deal of capacity don't spend their entire lives fulfilling government requirements for reporting and making another grant application, you know, for another 6 months or another year or whatever. Because when they're having to spend all their time doing that, they're not doing the really important work that they're meant to be doing, of working with their communities and building up their own staff capacities and so on. So I think that's what I would want to say to you about. It's about how I would start thinking about going about building it, not what would be in it. I think that has to be developed collaboratively with an Indigenous team.
Roxanne, have you comment on
I think, no, I absolutely agree with Janet, and I think the process is much more important, and as we were talking previous to this, these presentations this morning, contexts are they're different. There's different strokes for different folks. So you know, and that's one thing that needs to be acknowledged, is there's a great diversity of capacities out there and opportunities. So the context has everything to do with how. So you really can only implement a process for facilitating that, and not start imposing what the needs are or what particular, you know, tick box things will be needed in any individual organisation, because they're all going to be very different.
If I'm allowed a comment, I guess, as a chair, I think one comment I would make, and drawing from both Janet and Roxanne's research, I think if we're talking about whole of government approach, we really do need to unpack that. Mm-hmm. We really do need to explore what are the characteristics of a whole of government approach, and can we actually deliver? Do we have those attributes and characteristics? Because, you know, my own experience suggests we don't. We need to know more about it. You know, what works, what doesn't work. And I know in Janet's presentation, one of the you know, key elements was community capacity. She talked about the government arrangements. But really what's open a question here is government capacity, you know, to deliver its side of the equation. Absolutely. And so, you know, my own view, and I have, without sounding too cynical and, you know, I'm getting old and cranky, but we really do need to be serious if we're going to use language like whole of government. What does the concept mean? And more importantly, what does it mean for our Indigenous community participants? What does it mean for them? And can we deliver on it? So, Sally, I think there's perhaps some research maybe required there, I'm not sure, but it's an issue for me, I can tell you. Yeah, so thank you. Next question.
Leith Jewers from the Department of Veterans Affairs. In your research, you looked at communities and government. Did you look at any interactions between community and community? Being a Cape York man, there are a lot of things that work in the Aboriginal community because we're actually partnerships with other Aboriginal communities and not the government. Did your research cover any of that?
No, it didn't. I guess it didn't, but I guess from our own experience, we have had a little bit of experience in that, and I think that's why today, you know, we've presented ways of facilitating processes so that, so that it's a pretty simple, straightforward way of facilitating partnership processes, and it brings together common humanity rather than, and I guess that's where it's more generic, is because everyone's human, and despite being either from government or community relationships or whatever. So I think that's the angle we come from. Yeah.
No, I didn't actually find, because mine was a literature search. I didn't actually find anything, I don't think, that looked at Aboriginal partnerships, you know, with Aboriginal organisations. Yeah, maybe there's a bit of a gap in the research there.
Thank you for the question. Any next question? You're all being very shy. Is Dean?
I just wondered, Dean Jarrett from the UTS. I just wondered about cultural safety. In either of your research, was there any discussion or talk about cultural safety and what that means?
I don't think there was.
No.
Did you?
I asked that. I know that in New Zealand that they're about 20 years in front of us in terms of
they are.
engagement with the Maori community over there. And I just thought that some themes may have come up and principles around cultural safety may have arisen.
It did come up a little bit in the I think it was the early childhood studies. It came up a little bit there. The term didn't necessarily come up, but the idea comes up in a number of the studies, particularly the health ones. I think those sectors are the ones that really have grasped that concept and are taking it seriously. Yeah, I mean, I think it's kind of implicit in some ways in terms of, you know, the need for the non-Indigenous people working with Aboriginal people to have a much better understanding of Aboriginal ways of operating, how Aboriginal people, you know, where they would feel comfortable and safe, which is, you know, why don't necessarily do all the consultation in your office, you know, go out to where they feel comfortable and safe. That's a small element of the cultural safety, but it's an important one, I think. So, yeah, it's sort of implicit rather than made very explicit, except perhaps in the early childhood and one or two of the health studies. Yeah, didn't come out very strong, but sort of a cultural sensitivity by the non-Indigenous actors is certainly seen as very important, very important.
But actually, if you're interested, we're just negotiating with closing the gap at the current time to do an issues paper on cultural competency. So that should, I guess, would be extended next year, maybe, Therese. But it's a particularly important issue, and when you're thinking about cultural sensitivity, cultural safety, cultural competence, and along that continuum and what you're really talking about here. So I think, you know, that needs to be defined and explored more before you can really say, you know, and I think that's why it's not explicit, because I don't really think people realise or know or what they're really talking about here and what that looks like. So I think that's something that needs to be much better examined and defined before we can even start thinking about that, I guess.
Thanks for the question, Dean. Perhaps you've identified some fertile ground for further research, I'm sure. Thank you. I know we had a question up the back there. Thank you.
Yeah, hi, my name's Kirsten Turner and I'm from the Indigenous Affairs area in PMNC. So thank you both for talking to us. I got some really good messages today. But my question is more for Janet. I was just struck in the examples that you used for the literature review that not many of those case studies successfully used flexible funding in the true sense. A lot of the research talks about why flexible funding is really important, and it talks about the barriers to the successful implementation of flexible funding. And I was wondering if you had any examples of success in that area and how that strengthened partnerships across community and government.
Well, I think the example I gave you, there was an element of flexible funding in there, in part because some of the money was the community's own. I think the Murdy Parkey study, Wendy's still here, no, she won't go. Had some elements of more flexible funding. It was, you know, it was very, it was the most successful, I would say, of the COAG trials. I don't know that there were a lot there was no study that looked specifically at flexible funding that of the ones I looked at about engagement. So I was looking at engagement, obviously. But it kept coming up as the need for more flexible funding. It just kept coming up in all the studies. I'm just trying to recall whether there were... I don't think there were a lot that actually had a great deal of flexible funding, but the need for it... I think Fitzroy Futures Forum has some flexibility in the funding. Somebody mentioned that earlier. Yeah. So they've got some flexible funding. Some of the RPAs have more flexible funding than other examples, but they haven't all, as far as I know, not all have been hugely successful. Some have, some haven't. But it's a constant demand to have more flexible funding. So, yeah. How you get that through, you know, how you reach that, I think that's maybe one of those things that we need to look at in terms of the capacity building, because if you can do that, you release latent capacity. I talk about the concept of latent capacity. There's capacity there, but it's being kind of tied up at the moment. And if you can change the surrounding conditions, i.e. the funding arrangements, you can release some of that capacity.
Right, okay, thanks.
I'd just like to go back to one of the questions you answered a bit earlier about the AMSs, about successful programs. I think that's probably one that stands out on its own because it's ongoing funding, and also they generate funding through doctors and bulk billing and all that, so that's just one good model. And I think if we can go away from here thinking that long-term sustainable funding helps Aboriginal communities a lot rather than short-term funding, and also the funding cycle on reporting, and when you actually want to start a program and to the time that you get the funding, then you've got a 5-month gap before you've got to spend the money. And I think that creates a big issue for Aboriginal communities, small communities out in New South Wales.
Thank you for your comment. I mean, I think there's a number of, including a report from the Lowager Institute about the red tape and the restraints that non-flexible funding apply, and it's certainly counterproductive with any capacity building as well as onerous reporting. So hopefully people will take that on board here. Policy community?
You can get a $300,000 funding grant and then you've got to report $2 million.
That's right.
That's virtually what it's like, and some small Aboriginal organisations haven't got the capacity to do that.
That's right. But thank you for the point. Sorry, up the back. Sorry if I missed community.
Quarry PMNC. I'm presuming that most of the research that you've been doing is based on the cultural context of the public service. With moves that we see towards economic development, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities are going to be needing to negotiate in the private enterprise culture. So has there been much research about those outcomes?
Not a lot. There's been more in Canada than here in terms of mining agreements and things like that. There is a little in Australia, and it generally points to exactly the same things that I was saying. It's about equalising up the power relationships, time, agreements that are clear and everybody understands. It's clear outcomes. It's very much consistent with what I said there, and it's incorporated into what I said there because there is a bit, largely from the Canadian literature on that. But yeah, you're right. It is more flexible, again, that money, I think, often. But your point about long-term and secure, very important.
Roxanne, did you have a comment?
No.
We'll go. Question.
Hi, Virginia Carlton Hall, Indigenous Affairs, which used to be Faxio. I wanted to ask about cultural safety that was mentioned earlier. In our experience, we've been working with encouraging all the research that's appropriate coming out of our area to use local researchers and work with Aboriginal people and train them up, which has been happening, growing in some areas and still small in other areas. One example of how we just don't know about the cultural safety of any area. We've come in from completely different backgrounds. I was working in a town camp in Alice Springs, and we had a very experienced Aboriginal researcher there. And the ethical problem of having to alert families that if there was some thought that there may be some difficulty with children, they may be abused or whatever, they would have to be reported. And of course, this Aboriginal researcher who's local said, I can't do that. My safety is important, my family's safety is important. So talking that through and being able to work with the local organisation who supported that whole community was able to come out with another answer to that ethical problem. But the point I want to make, and I want to ask about the Aboriginal Researchers Network, is it's the local people who know this stuff. And unless we work with Aboriginal researchers, we wouldn't have a clue. So I was wondering if there was some examples or the things that you're noticing from the Aboriginal Researchers Network growing.
I think it's very new. We only really just got funding, not just maybe 4 or 5 months ago. So yeah, we haven't really done anything around cultural safety issues, but these issues go back, many, many years to, if you look at the NH and MRC values, for example, and the guidelines, this isn't new. It should have been happening a long time ago and never has, and it's still not. And I guess there's a lot of reasons that doesn't happen, and it is around funding, the timing of funding, things like that. They're just not going to fund you to do that. Well, they say, on the one hand, they say you need to adhere to these principles. On the other hand, there's no opportunity to actually do that very often. So you've got to be quite creative in your own research work to make that happen, I guess, yeah.
Thank you for the question. Sorry, I think I missed somebody in the front here. My apology if I've done that.
Hi, I'm Megan Fraser from Camp Dog Communications. I just wanted to pick up one of the questions about that asked about sort of examples or models for the flexible funding, and one that I am aware of, which you could look at, was there was a very genuine attempt in the Department of Health made to develop guidelines and funding that included flexible funding and flexible reporting around the local community campaigns, which was Live Longer. So you could look at that as a good example where we actually worked very closely with communities to develop the guidelines around this funding program where they could develop the solutions to their own health, chronic health diseases, problems. So it can be done. It took a lot of, it was risky, but it was sort of like suck it and see. You know, it's a different approach that health could take in a social marketing framework. And there are some good results coming out of that, so you may want to look at it.
Thank you. Now, look, we are running out of time. I'm sorry to be the bearer of bad news, but I'm suggesting we've probably got time for one more question, maybe. Two if they're brief, but so we'll go.
Sharon Clark, Indigenous Broadcasting. Firstly, I'd like to agree with Roxanne about the importance of process in the engagement from government. I was involved in Northern Territory, the first model of the Shires, which Janet referred to. And whilst in that role, I recall a successful study undertaken by John Taylor with the Tumara community, which looked at the opportunity costs. And I just wondered whether you saw the merits, you know, whether the merits from that work could be applied in communities being able to articulate things better, you know, in terms of identifying their priorities, in terms of the opportunity cost model.
I think, John's study is a very good study of the opportunity costs of basically people not being engaged. And I think one of the things I'd say about that, and people can look at that study on the website, but I think one of the things I'd say is that often we talk about risk. Governments are very loath to take too many risks. But the risk of not changing the way we operate is that Aboriginal people bear that risk, because there's a risk of having shorter lives and, you know, all the chronic problems that we know exist in many Aboriginal communities. So when we talk about risk, we need to think about who's bearing that risk, who's carrying that risk, and weigh up the risks that government sees with the risks Aboriginal people are taking because government isn't changing the way it does its business. And I think that's something we all need to just think about. So, yeah, there's a big opportunity cost of not changing.
On that note, I'm sorry, I think we'll have to draw it to a close. I know we're under a time restraint, as I explained. Can I just, before we thank our speakers, just remind people that the record of today's proceedings will be on the website. For those of you who weren't able to take copies of the papers, they are also available on the website, and I'd encourage you to access those papers. And so without any further ado, all we should do now is thank both of our speakers. Thanks very much. And thanks to you all for coming along and supporting the activity. Much appreciated. Thank you.